Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC and is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav HaShalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav HaShalom, Rabbi Yael HaKoyen Khan Olav HaShalom, and is in schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel HaKoyen and Risha Katz Le'orich Yomim V'shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. We are in chapter 6, Perek Vav of Tanya, which is the Zel Umazeh chapter, you can call it, that after studying chapters 2, 3, 4, 5 about the divine soul, its faculties, and its garments of expression, we now move Zel Umazeh, the parallel world, a parallel image of an exactly the same mirror image of the divine is in the animal soul, but this is on the other side. We'll soon learn about what the other side, Sitra Achra, means. And here it's a parallel mirror image, the same faculties and garments, the animal soul, but here the focus is the exact opposite, diametric opposite. Where the divine soul is focused on transcendence, on higher awareness, on a God-centric life, the animal soul is focused like an animal on an egocentric life, self, survival, my needs. But it also has the 10 faculties. It has its personality of the animal soul, which began being discussed in the end of chapter 1. It has its faculties, 10 faculties, mind and emotions, as we discussed in the beginning of chapter 6. And the last class we spoke about the garments of expression, that the machshava, dibur, and maisa, the thought, speech, and action, as they relate to the animal soul, are expressing, either thinking about, speaking, or acting on animal soul's interests, the self-interests of the animal soul. In the language of the Tanya, he said the following words: Ve'eseb chinas elo hatmeis k'sha'odam mechashev behen oimedabra oise, that in these 10 impure powers of the animal soul, when a person thinks, speaks, or acts, hare machshavte shebemechi v'diburi shebepiv v'keich ha'maisi shebeyodav v'sharei vorov nikroim levushei misavu le'eseb chinas elu atmeis shemislapshin behem b'shas maise oy diburei machshave. So the thought in the mind, and the speech in the mouth, and the action in his hands, or other of his other limbs, they're called impure garments. Because when the faculties of the animal soul, their interest as faculties is interested in self-interest, like the faculties of the divine soul are interested in the divine. But that's still a faculty. It could remain dormant. When it's actualized and expressed in the garments, the thought, speech, and action become impure garments, because that's where they're manifesting. Negative thoughts, negative words, and negative actions. Negative meaning, not the way we were created in order to be aligned with the divine and the transcendent, but about self-interest. Egocentric interests. So at the moment of that action, speech, and thought, that's what they are. They're impure. Why at the moment? Because remember, like garments, they can be changed. We'll learn later in Tanya, you can move your thought and change your thought to a positive thought, to a holy thought, to a God-centric thought. And the same thing with speech and action. But while they're essentially following the direction and guidance of the animal faculties, or the faculties of the animal soul, they are impure. And then the Alter Rebbe continued, and we learned this as well inside. So he says like this: V'hein heim kol hamaisim. He's going to go now through maisa, dibur, and machshava. But here he spells it out. Now he's summing up. He says, so these are all the maisim. Asher nasim tachas hashemesh asher hakol hevel u're'us ruach. Using the verse in Kehelis that we cited. That these are all the actions that constitute all the things are done under the sun. It's an expression, meaning all actions that we do in this world. which are all empty and a strain to the spirit. That's the meaning of hevel. Hevel is like hollow, empty. Even vanity, you can say. Uru'us ruach means a strain, a tension, a pressure on the soul and the spirit of the human being. Why? Because they're focused on self and selfishness, self-interest. And that's what it says in Zohar. There he uses the word actually. Shein teviru derucha. The Zohar writes in B'Shalach, they're destructive to the spirit. Any actions, like he says there, this is the language. Kol ha'maisu shnas tachas Hashemes. So the Zohar says, Kol milin, the misavdin, the lav in pulchana de kutshabrichu. All the actions that are done, that are not directed toward serving God, toward the love of God, serving God, iyu tfira derucha. And uses the verse in Keheles, hevel uru'us ruach. They're destructive to the spirit. So that is, he says, maisim. And that's where we stopped. Now he's going to go, he said, v'chein kol hadiburim v'chol hamachshavos asher lo laHashem heimo u'leritzeinei u'lavaydosei. And this applies, in the same, he says, are all the spoken words, diburim, or thoughts for kol hamachshava, and all the thoughts. There he said kol hamaisim that we do under the sun on earth. Now he's saying all the words that we speak and all the thoughts which are not directed toward God, asher lo laHashem heimo u'leritzeinei, and to God's will, to fulfill His will, u'la'aveidosei, and to worship Him, to serve Him. So 3 expressions. They're not directed to God or to His will. But it doesn't say or. You could say and to His will and to serving Him. So what about them? He says, and that is, he can explain, Shezeu pirush loshen sitra achra. That means sitra achra. Pirush tzad achra she'ein tzad hakdusha. As immediately as they're not directed to God, they're directed to the other side. That means sitra achra. This is the meaning of sitra achra, which translates as the other side, anything which is not the holy side. And we're going to explain this in a moment. I just want to fill continue. And he's going to continue to explain what is the tzad hakdusha. But all of this is coming to say, all this is coming from the other side, the animal soul's garments that are impure. But now the Alter Rebbe is going to explain what this means, sitra achre, because it's vital to understand the animal soul. But before we go there, let's just analyze this a bit more. On a ostensible level, when you learn this piece in Tanya, it seems to be following what he said before. He says before that just like the faculties are impure, so then he continued and he said, the same thing is now with the garments. When a person thinks or speaks and acts on them, meaning the expression in the garments, so they become impure garments as we just discussed. So then the Alter Rebbe seems to be saying now it's going to bring it back down to practicality. That these are all the actions and the words and the thoughts that we do in this world. That would seem to be the flow. But when you really look closely, you see it's not exactly the case. And the Rebbe Rashab actually makes a strong point about it. What does he say? He says, before when he said it, because seemingly you could say this is a repeat. Why does he have to say, let's say he took away all the words, V'hein heim kol ha'maisim, asher nasim. He already said that when a person thinks and speaks and acts based on the faculties of the animal soul, he says those are impure garments. They're called, he said, levushim mesavu. So what is he adding here? Says the Rebbe Rashab, he's adding a critical point here. when you say there, they're already talking about thought, speech, and action, that the thought, speech, and action has something that is defying God. What he calls atzir of ra. There's some element of atzir of ra. So you're already talking about someone either doing the opposite of not doing a mitzvah or doing something that is forbidden to do. Here, the focus is Ashalei Hashem Hema. Means it doesn't say you're doing something wrong. You're just not doing it for the purpose of God. They're not directed to God. They're not directed to God's will. They're not directed to God's service. So what is it? You would think it's neutral. Because seemingly there are three categories. Things you're supposed to do, mitzvah. Things are isur, that you're not allowed to do. We'll learn this later in the next chapter. So a heter, which means you're allowed to do. There are things that are a mitzvah to do, I should say. Things that are not allowed to do. And then there's divrei reshus. Reshus means it's neutral. You can do it either way. You could do it for the purpose of God. You could do it for your own selfish purpose. But it could also be neutral. You eat a meal, and you know what? You're not thinking about God. You're also not thinking about yourself. You're just eating nonchalant. You're not thinking about anything. It's neutral. Comes the Alter Rebbe and introduces a concept here. Without saying these words, he's basically saying, it's either God or it's not God. So even if it's not directly defined, it's not a thought, speech, or action that's forbidden, but it's not directed, Hashem Hema, that already means it's not neutral. Now, why not? Why can't you say it's neutral? It's because, at the end of the day, any act that's not saturated and permeated with a higher awareness and transcendence of godliness is ultimately going to be subject to the inertia of the animal soul and its ego consciousness and its egocentric consciousness. So it may not be forbidden, but because God is Ein Milvadi, nothing but God, the truth of God, so there are things you can do that are, God forbid, against God, but as soon as you're ignoring God, you're already on a slippery slope. Now this just shows you the high level intensity of divine awareness in a person's life. So it's not just we're talking about Chol Drachecha De'eyu B'chol Masecha L'Shem Shemayim. Chol Drachecha De'eyu means in all your ways you should know God. In all your actions should be L'Shem Shemayim, for the sake of heaven. That's not talking about a mitzvah. A mitzvah is a commandment. This is talking about Maisecha. It's your regular actions. You're walking in the street. You're going shopping. You're eating. You're drinking. You're sleeping. You're doing business. Chol Drachecha, your ways. That too needs to be permeated with a God consciousness. And if not, it's the Sitra Achre. Now it's interesting, he uses Sitra Achre. Why? Because Sitra Achre means the other side. He doesn't say Sitra Dara. Before he said impure garments. Misavu, he used the words. And earlier, it used the word Tmeis. Elo HaTmeis, impurity. Here he's using the other side. But as soon as it's not the side of God, it's not the side of holiness, it's the other side, is already a problem. And that's the diuk here. The question is it referring to all three things, the Maisim, Tachas HaShemesh, what he said in the beginning, Elam, that these are the expression that he used. Veheinem kol ha-maisim shenasim tachas hashemesh. Because there he does use the word hevel, uru'us ruach, that it breaks the spirit. So you could say, yes, he refers to that as well, because breaking the spirit doesn't have to be something forbidden. Or is the kol ha-maisim still an extension of what he said till now? And chen kol ha-deburim v'chol ha-machshavash shalei la-Hashem heima. But you could say shalei la-Hashem heima is not just going on the words and on the action and on thoughts. You could say shalei la-Hashem heima is also referring to kol ha-maisim. Even though the verse in Kehelis he uses on the first section maisim. So that could be discussed, could be including both scenarios. But one thing is clear, that as soon as it's not directed to God and to His will and to His service, there's no such thing as neutral. That already goes into the category of the Sitra Achre. Shazel Pirush Lashon Sitra Achre. That as soon as it does not have a divine intention, is different than the word Ra, evil, Tuma, impure, Klippe even, which is a shell. Here you're saying Sitra Achra, the other side. Frierdiker Rebbe once said, the Rebbe would quote it quite often, that life is like climbing a mountain. You're either going up or you're going down. There's no in between. There's no plateau. You could say, 1 second, I'm not going up and I'm not going down. No. It's like they say the joke about, someone said, I used to think I'm indecisive, now I'm not so sure. Indecisive doesn't mean neutral. That also is a position. So a person is either going and embracing God, or he's embracing, even if he's not doing something against, the fact that he's not embracing God is also called the other side. And this is all part of the animal soul. So there's the animal soul as it manifests in things that are really forbidden, and we're going to learn about that. We're not talking here shalosh klippos hatmeis, which is things that are absolute dvarim asurim, completely forbidden. We're talking klippas nega. If you remember, the animal soul is rooted in klippas nega, the illuminated klippa, the one that is transparent, the one that's a membrane, a shell, but it's nega, it shines. It's not completely concealing the divine within it, the divine spark. It's concealing, but not completely. Like, let's say, a hard nut would conceal the fruit within it in a very hard way. Here it could be like the membrane of a grape or an olive. Klippas nega. It could, we're going to learn soon how that could also go downward, but even that is already called klippa. Or sitra achra, which is even more mild, the other side. So this is a fascinating idea in loyalty. Think about it in very practical terms. Let's say you're part of an army. You're a soldier in the army. So you're dedicated to the cause. You're fighting for the king or the leader or the empire or a good cause. Then there's someone in the opposite. Now a person could defect and turn the other direction. That's literally defying and going against his loyalty. But what happens if a soldier says, I'm not defecting, I'm not going to the other side, meaning to the other team or the opponent. I'm just not going to be involved. I'm staying home one day. I'm neutral. That's also considered mutiny, because you're supposed to be fighting for the side. What does it mean that you're taking off? I'm not talking about with his leave. A person just decides they're lazy, or they don't want to, or they decide they're going to not get involved in politics, so to speak. That's not considered, it's neutral seemingly, but it's not. Because if you're not with me, you're against me. Even if you're not my opponent, but you're not fighting on this side of the cause. In Kedusha, it means our whole life is dedicated to God. So even if there's 1 second or there's one activity that's not directed there, that's already called the other side. Is it as extreme as someone that goes to the actually defects? Obviously not. That's why this is not called isur. This is not called forbidden. But the call of Kedusha could also not. And now he's going to explain why. Because the question still remains, why can't there really be something that's neutral? Why is it either or? Why is it either going to ultimately be subject to the egocentric consciousness, the ego consciousness of the animal soul, if it's not directed toward God? So the Alter Rebbe continues, and he says, but now we have to understand what's tzad ha'kedusha. If you say sitracha, the other side, what is the first side? What is this side of it, of the coin? So he says, the tzad ha'kedusha, he's going to explain what is kedusha, and by contrast, we'll understand what's not kedusha. This is yet another brilliant, succinct, and powerful summary of principles in Torah. You don't say the word kedusha. People use holiness, sanctity, separation. But what does it really mean that something is a holy thing? Even a godly thing, and something that's not? So he's going to give us a real, full, practical definition that you can even say can be explained to any person, even in universal secular terms. And here are the Alter Rebbe's words. V'tzad ha'kedusha, what he says like this. The holy side is nothing but Einei Ella. He doesn't say what it is. He's saying it's nothing but, what is it? It's only something in which God's holiness can be drawn and be present. Let's translate. Elo, hashirov amshochem mikdushosei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So holiness means something in which resides. And there's a presence, hashirah, a presence, and amshach, a transmission, and being drawn from kdushosei, from the holiness shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So let's spell that out. That means Kedusha in this world, something that is called holy, and Sada Kedusha, which is the opposite of Sitra Achra, is a place where the divine holiness, which is the source of all holiness, the source of all higher state of existence, comes from the Eibishter. So we say something is holy here, a Sefer Torah, or something that we call Kodesh, Mokem Hamigdosh, the holy temple, the Temple Mount. Why is it a holy place? Why are you not supposed to walk there? Why do you have certain rules and care and respect we have to show for it? Because it's an extension. Again, Eine Elo, Hashra v'Hamshochem Mikdushosei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's essentially a channel, like a seamless channel that's drawing down from the source of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the question is, how does that happen? Why can't we say anything draws it down? Why can't you say that Kedusha is anywhere? So now he explains. Ve'ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheira el al dover shabatl etzlei yizbarach. This is the punchline. And God's presence, or you can say God, does not rest and reside, sheira, it's the same word like hashra, does not dwell, rest on a thing which is not surrendered and submitted and sublimated and subjugated itself to Him. Again, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheira, since we want Kedusha of the Eibishter, and the Eibishter does not rest, Elo, only, again he says in the negative, which always is more of a liikuva, eliminating any possibility. He could have said, V'tzad HaKedusha hu ashrov amshochem HaKedusha shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheira al dover shabatl. But Ein Elo is always liikuva, means much more intense. You're saying Tzad HaKedusha is nothing but, it's excluding any other possibility, because the Alter Rebbe here doesn't want to leave a neutral third position. So if it's not drawing down, it's not the divine, is not residing there, then it's the other side, as we'll learn in a moment. And the same, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God does not reside, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheira, Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheira, El al dover shabatl etzlei yizbarach. Only on something that is empty. Like it says, God says, I, an arrogant person, cannot reside under the same canopy. Why? Because like a filled cup. If your cup is full, there's no room for anyone else. You want godliness in your life? You want holiness? You need to be empty. A clay daikon. If not, you're filled with yourself. There's no room for anything else. So the Eibishter does not reside only on something. Batel is a very powerful word. Batel literally means can be nullified before Him, surrendered. It can mean subjugated. It can be sublimated. All these correct words. We don't mean it in a negative way. It doesn't mean annihilated in a negative way. It means you're emptying yourself in order to receive something greater than you are. You're suspending yourself to receive something greater. Kedusha could rest there. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Kedusha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, can reside there. I saw in a mimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe, Sefer Mamorim Yiddish, he translates Bittel, Übergegebenkeit, devotion, dedication, commitment. And he says, Koyach HaBittel is the Kraft von Übergegebenkeit, the power, the art of devotion, of dedication. So the Eibishter does not reside except in that situation, with his bittul. Ego, there's no room for anyone else. Even like you think of it like a student and a teacher. If the student is filled with himself, he's not empty enough, how is he going to be able to receive something? If you're convinced in your mind of your opinion, how will you ever learn something? So the only way this can reside, it's not a condition like the Eibishter just made a condition, a supra-rational condition. It makes total sense. There's no room for me. You're not letting me into your life. So bittul is critical in this sense. And then he continues. Now he's going to continue and saying he's going to give two scenarios where we see this type of bittul. In actuality, by the angels, and potentially by Kol Ish Yisrael. That's the next section here. But before we go there, I want to elaborate a little more on this point. Because then he's going to go, just to give you the flow, he's going to go now and speak more about this bittul. But then the Alter Rebbe is going to go back. I'm not skipping, I'm going to go back to it. I just want to give you the flow. So then he says, anything, however, she'ena bot letzlei is baruch, it's a few lines later, which has not surrendered itself, which is not committed or devoted or suspended itself in the face of God. It hasn't surrendered its ego to God, and it sees itself, and he continues. She'ena bot letzlei is baruch, elu dover nifred. Because if he's not bottled to that, then what is he? He's then a separate entity to itself. Dover nifred b'fnei atzmei. Because it's either you're connected to something greater or you're connected to yourself, which means you're a separate thing from godliness on your own. An entity to itself. So this will not receive its life energy from God's holiness. It will receive energy. And he's going to explain how. Because it wouldn't exist if it doesn't have divine energy. But to say that it is a transparent, a seamless channel for Kedusha, no. So that makes it Sitra Achre. So as soon as it's not directed to God, it's directed to self. Fine, it's not necessarily directed right now to opposite of God. But it's not God. So you can't call that, so it's not a Keli for Kedusha. It doesn't have bittul. Which, of course, if you think about it, is radical in a good way. It gives us a whole different take. In other words, it's the bittul to God that is expected of us. It's true. There's a performance of mitzvahs and things you're not supposed to do. But the real goal is the commitment to God. And if you're not committed to God, if it's not directed to commitment to God, so you're committed to yourself. So even if it's not defying God directly, in essence, you're not a keli to be in God's army, so to speak. You're not an extension of what God wants in this world. So it's not a keli for Kedusha. That's going to be the oisfir as he finishes. But in between, we still have to go back, and we'll do this in the next year, how bittul expresses itself in actuality and in potential, and then he's going to go back to Sitra Achre and continue discussing the animal soul. But here is getting insight into the divine soul, into the focus on the divine, which is the stark contrast, the parallel image, zelumazeh, of the animal soul. So we shall stop here. Everyone have a good tavoch. Please go to Tanya Applied, where all these programs are recorded and archived. You can also submit any of your questions. Thank you.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit chasidusapplied.com for archived classes and more resources.